Welcome Lauren Pryor to the Redeem podcast. She is a mother, a wife, a licensed counselor. She has gone through some things that I believe probably no one has gone through, and I hope nobody has to go through, to be honest. Within less than a week, 3 days, she experienced the loss of her husband and then the birth of her first child. Can you imagine? I think about this, having that first child and all the things that go with that, preparing for a nursery. What's he going to look like? What's it going to be like? Am I going to be able to nurse? All these things, all these thoughts. But do you ever imagine your husband not being there the day that your child is born? Have you ever found yourself struggling in the midst of life thinking, this is not what I had planned or hoped for? Well, then you are not alone, my friend. Life has its ups and downs, no matter how well we thought we planned things out. Welcome to the Redeemed podcast, where we will encourage others through personal experience, even when life does not go the way we planned it. Through various interviews, you will hear amazing stories of lives being transformed, even in impossible situations. My name is Lauren Burns, and I am the host of the Redeemed podcast. Lauren's going to share a little bit of background about her husband, their relationship, and the things that she walked through during those times and her journey of grief and what God has done to restore and redeem her life. So please welcome Lauren to the podcast today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lauren.
You're welcome.
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Lauren, tell me a little bit about your husband, how you guys met, and what your life looked like before becoming pregnant and going through that part of your journey.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll go back. See, my first husband and I met on a blind date, actually, set up by a mutual friend. He was tall and handsome, and he was a musician, and I thought he was incredibly attractive. He loved the Lord. He had sort of shared with me, and you kind of could tell that he had somewhat of a past. He'd struggled with some things, but there was something about that that even made him more genuine. It made him seem more real and upfront, and he loved the Lord. He knew what it was like to walk through hardship, and so he also walked in that grace beautifully and humility, and that was all so attractive to me. So we dated for quite a few years, and then finally got married and started a life together and made plans and dreams about our future. We were both living in Tennessee at the time. That's where I'm from. Made dreams and hopes that we might move to Colorado someday. And we started making plans toward that end. And then he went through some really tough medical issues, actually, had some really tough diagnoses that led him to have two really major surgeries that were really tough, scary time in our lives. And through that, some of those past struggles came bubbling back to the surface. And he began to struggle with addiction. That was something he had struggled with way back in college, and he had overcome that and was a good man, like I said, who loved the Lord. He read his Bible every day. He was just a solid believer. But as he walked through this really difficult time and through these major surgeries, the addiction to those pain medications became a real struggle in his life. He was well respected in the community, he had a good job, he worked in the medical field, we attended church, we served on teams, we volunteered, we did it all. We were in small groups. But behind the scenes, he really struggled with shame and struggled with fighting that addiction. And
Mhm.
I had always wanted to be a mom. I longed for children, but as he struggled with these health issues and with this addiction, that had been put on the back burner for good reason. But as time went on and that struggle became real, I began to just really long for children and wonder if that was ever going to happen. Would it ever be a good time? And would God allow that to happen in my life? Eventually, I did get pregnant, and
Mhm.
I was thrilled, and he was scared. As the pregnancy went on, he wanted to be a good dad, he longed to be a good father, and he knew that he needed to deal with his issues.
Can I ask you, when y'all were dating, and was it alcohol? Was it drugs? Was it pain pills back then? What was that addiction prior?
Yeah, like, back in college, it was kind of a little bit of everything. I think he drank some, I think he smoked weed some. It wasn't a
Okay.
lot, it wasn't a ton, it was just some experimentation and then some a little this, little of that, and then he'd
But
finally
then
come.
those pain pills sort
Yes,
of
right.
spiraled. And when you were talking about he was a Christian and he was well known in the church and he had this shame, I think we put these labels on people of addiction or alcoholism, whatever it is, a cheater, liar,
Mhm.
whatever. And you stick all these labels on, but God says, "No, you are redeemed. I call you my child.
Yeah,
These things that you're struggling with, it's not who you are, it's the thing that
absolutely.
you're struggling with." But we as a church, I think that's where we fail people.
Yeah,
We're supposed to be a place of love and grace and kindness and to walk people through these hardships and not to label them and shun them and to a place where you're too embarrassed to even say what's going on.
yeah,
Who did Jesus minister to in the Bible over and over again? You want to talk about him the utmost respect, and this is just something that he was dealing with.
right. It is not the sum of his life, it is not
Mhm,
who he was, it is the struggle that he dealt with, and that was his battle that he
mhm,
fought. It was just that, it was his battle, it was not who he was,
mhm,
and I knew that, and the people that loved him knew that. He battled a lot of shame in exposing that, which I think a lot of people who deal with any kind of struggle,
mhm,
the fear of being judged, the fear of being
mhm,
looked as less than, and then also just the pride, thinking, I'm gonna take care of it on my own. I'm gonna handle this on my own. He would even say, "Yeah, me and God, we're gonna deal with this." It kept him from maybe getting professional help or for seeking out care that he really probably needed. That was unfortunate. As at some point in my pregnancy, things began to take a turn for the worse. I think the fear of my largely growing belly and this baby that was coming. I said he longed to be a good father, but there was just so much fear and so much shame that he was battling that began to almost take over. That was really scary for me as his pregnant wife who's loves him so deeply and dearly and is watching this happen before my eyes. So things began to really go downhill. I was getting more and more pregnant and things were going downhill in his life, which was hard.
What did that look like with your relationship? Because being pregnant,
Yeah,
being hormonal,
yeah,
all the things, and you're working, you're a
yeah,
full-time counselor during this
right. Yep.
part, a trauma counselor, is that correct?
Uh-huh. Correct. It was not easy. In some ways, it was really hard to then go to work and help other people, but in other ways, it became a distraction too for me. It was a place that I could go and still feel good about who I was and what I could
Mhm.
offer to other people and then not worry about my own problems. And that's just speaking
It's your
honestly.
outlet.
Yeah, exactly. It also was an outlet for me, and I worked for an amazing company, Christian company, counseling agency, and just had the most amazing boss and coworkers. At some point, as things began to get worse, I did begin to tell more people. For so long, he had hid in shame, and so had I. I had hid with him and protected. And at some point, I realized that I need help and I can't do this alone. I
Mhm.
began to reach out to close, trusted people and say, "Hey, I need you to pray. I need you to pray for my husband. I need you to pray for my marriage. I need you to pray for this baby." It looked like setting boundaries, some really hard boundaries sometimes about even his use to say, like, "Hey, if you're going to be using, I'm going to go stay with a friend. I'm not going to
Mhm.
be around you when you're like this. If you've taken too many and you're acting a certain way, I'm not going to be around that. And that's too hard. It's too stressful for me to be around. So I'm gonna go stay with a friend, but I'm gonna come back tomorrow. I was always really clear to say, "I'm not leaving you. I'll be
Mhm.
back tomorrow, but I'm not gonna be around you when you're like that." I had to set some really hard boundaries, and that was tough. Eventually, it came to the point where I just said, "Okay, you've gotta go to rehab, and in the meantime, I'm gonna go stay with my parents. I'm gonna have this baby, and you're gonna go to rehab." Things had progressed to a point where he finally knew that he needed to do that.
How far along were you in your pregnancy when you decided, "I'm gonna go stay with my parents, and you need to go to rehab?"
It was in December. In fact, I can tell you the exact date, it was December 15th. I know what happened, I can go back and relive it, I know exactly. I finally decided and just in tears and in prayer to the Lord knew I remember going to him and saying, "I love you. but this is what's gotta happen. I've gotta get out of the way. I have to get out of the way, and you have to deal with this. You and God have gotta take care of this, and I've gotta go focus on me and focus on this baby." On December 15th, and my son was born in January. About a month later, my world actually really did come crashing down. Things had progressed to the point where he did know that he needed to go to rehab, and he was planning on going. I was at my parents' house. I woke up in the middle of the night to a phone call to a strange man, talking on the phone, asking where I was and why I was not where they thought I would be, because again, I was at my parents' house and not home. They were very confused and been trying to track me down for quite some time. He said they were sending an officer out to greet me and wouldn't tell me anything else. That my husband had been in a car accident, but they were sending someone. And I think deep down, even in that moment, I knew someone out just to tell you to come to the hospital. They sent someone out, and in that moment, my world shattered. The bottom dropped out. I fell to my knees with my
Mhm.
very belly in my hands with no clue as to what would happen next.
Thank God that you were at least with your parents and not alone,
Oh,
and your parents already knew what was going on because so many times and I think listening to what you're saying, as a wife, you wanna respect and honor your husband. It's like, "I don't wanna tell my parents, I don't wanna tell my friends, I don't wanna the shame, the guilt, I don't want them to look down on my husband," but thankfully, you went ahead and reached out to people because it's even harder when you're in that lonely place.
yeah, for a long time, like you said, I did not wanna dishonor him, I didn't want other
Yeah.
people to judge him. He didn't really want me to tell other people,
Mhm.
and I understood that, and I didn't wanna disrespect him. I think at some point it had progressed to a level that I just knew I need support, and so does he. And
Mhm.
my parents are amazing people. They in fact, when they found out, they rallied around him and said, "Look, we
Mhm.
love you. You're our son. We're gonna support you. You need to go get help, but we're gonna support you. We're gonna support our daughter and your son in any way that we need to
Mhm.
while you do that." And they loved him, and which I remember him sitting at their table just in tears because I don't think he
Mhm.
even knew what to do with that love because he wasn't expecting it
Yeah,
at all.
and that's the love and the grace that God shows us. We were talking about the church.
Mhm,
That's what God wants. It's like, "Hey, I know you're in trouble. I know you're gonna mess up, but I'm gonna love you and
mhm,
accept you for who you are," and especially for your parents because
mhm.
you're their little girl. They wanna protect you, and the enemy wants to put those lies in our heads of, "Don't tell anybody. You can't disrespect your husband," all that shame, and all that shame is that's lies to try to keep us hidden and hiding, and so thank God that your parents were there. Gosh, Lauren, I can't imagine what that day, that night was like and that officer being at your parents' house and your whole world shattering.
Mhm.
What was the days to come? Things happen rapidly.
Yes, they did. There is a numbness that follows that initial shock, right, with grief, and that is on purpose. I think that's by design. I think God made us that
Mm,
way on purpose because he knows that it's almost too much. It's too much to handle. And so there's a numbness that comes. And not to say that there weren't a lot of tears too, but there's a certain level of almost that you go numb, you disconnect and you're crying and you're sad, but it's just you're in this fog. I heard someone say you're a grief zombie. And I thought, yes,
mhm.
that's exactly
Yeah.
what it's like. You're just walking through life as this zombie. And so there I was, kind of this grief zombie, but also very pregnant and only 10 days away from my due date at that point. So part of that grief fog takes over and numbness, and through the help of a lot of amazing community and just family and friends that rallied around me, I was able to plan a funeral and get things done. And I literally had a doctor's appointment to make sure my baby was okay. And I left
Yeah.
that, went to the hospital to see my husband's body. It's just
Mm,
wildly 2 extreme things that can there's no way that I could have held those things together if it were not for God. If it were
mhm,
not for his big, amazing hands holding me in the middle of that, I could not have done
mhm,
it. I planned a funeral, began to do all the things, and went to bed that night and woke up in the middle of the night, and my water broke. So here
mm,
we were. Now I was in labor. On the 3rd day, 3 days later, sort of ironic, 3 days later, I gave birth to our son. And it's a wild thing because a year later, it was New Year's, almost a year later, I remember reflecting back over the year. And at one point, I remember thinking, gosh, it was the worst year of my life. I stopped and I said, no, I can't
Mm,
say it was the worst year of my life. I could just as easily tell you it was the best year of my life because it's the
mm,
year I became a mom. It is both. It was
yeah.
both the worst and somehow the best. I also became a mother that year, and
Mhm.
I got to experience death, yes, and that was awful, but then I also got to experience life and
Wow.
become a mom, and I experienced those things together, and so I kinda concluded, well, it was definitely the hardest. It was definitely the hardest year of my life by far, but I can't ever say it was the worst, and so
Now, I can't imagine being in the hospital room and holding your son and all the things going through your mind, the first mom anyways, and then looking at your child and seeing your husband in
mhm.
him and just golly, I just can't even imagine. You moved in with your parents, you lived with them for how long?
So I stayed with him then for about a year. Once
Good.
he passed, it was yeah, the bottom had just completely dropped out of my life, and I just kinda went back to square one. I remember I got some really amazing advice from a wonderful lady who had also lost her husband pretty young, and she said, "Don't make any decisions that first year."
Mm,
She said, "Let yourself off the hook and just do what you need to do. Take it one day at a time, take it 1 week at a time, 1 month at a time, whatever you need to do, but don't feel like you have to make any big decisions or any big just give yourself an out." And I
yeah.
thought that was a really solid advice. I thought, "I've got this new baby." My parents had a walkout basement that was easy. It was like its own apartment, that I could live in. And so, yes, I just stayed with them for a year. I left my job. I left
Mm.
everything that we had back where, because we lived in Middle Tennessee. I was from East Tennessee. Okay, we're going to start over. And I don't know what that looks like, but we're going to take it one day at a time. We stayed with them for a while. And then I actually moved back into our old house.
Kept your old house, the house that you were with your husband?
Yes, so
Okay.
ironically, we had moved to Middle Tennessee and tried to sell it, and it just would not sell, and we were so blown away. Why in the world? It didn't make sense. It didn't even make sense to the realtor. It was such a weird thing, and it was frustrating. I remember asking for prayer about it, so we put it up for rent, and so we had renters who had literally just signed a lease in December, right? He died in January, but we had people who had signed a lease and said they were gonna be there a year. And I didn't have to worry about it at all. I was also making rental income.
Good.
It was a beautiful way that God provided for me, that I had all those years of me praying that we would sell this place, and it didn't work, and I didn't know why, and then I was like, "Oh."
Now you have steady income and you can just be with your son and grieve and yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, it was a beautiful thing. When they moved out, when those renters moved out, I did not want to go back to that place. That was the place that we lived when we were first married, and I didn't wanna go back there, and God just said, "I need to redeem that place for you. I need to do some redemption there." So I was like, "Okay." And then I remember God saying, "I need you to go back there, but I promise you won't have to stay long."
Mm,
And I was like, "Alright." So we moved back in there, and there we were there for about 5 months, and then get this, I finally felt like circumstances aligned and God allowed for me and my son to move to Colorado. And that was a dream that my husband and I had for many years. And I thought,
mm.
okay, it's time to start fresh. It's been a year and a half now. It's time to start fresh and to start over and fulfill that dream and to see what God has for us.
So
And I
your son's like 15 months old, a year and a half at this point?
yeah,
So you're a widow and
uh-huh,
you have still a baby
yeah.
and you're gonna move to Colorado.
Yeah.
And do you have family? Do you know anyone there?
I know a few people, but not many.
That's
I had
wow,
family and people, but not a lot. Not like any major kind of family,
yeah.
anything like
So
that. It
you're
was
about to
just
go on a big adventure.
yes, it was a big adventure, it was a big dream, but it was so cool because I prayed about it, "Okay, God, like, I think this is where you're leading, I think this is where you want us to go," And so I said, "Okay, I'm not gonna go out there until my house sells because I've done that and I'm not gonna do that again. So I will put the house on the market and we'll see what happens." Just a few years earlier, it had been on the market for months and months and months with nothing. I put my
Mhm.
house on the market and 3 days later I had 3 offers.
Wow. That's when you're like, "All right, God, I
Yeah.
hear you. I
Yep.
see you. I'm being faithful. I'll continue to go down this path."
Exactly.
And
So
that's
I
what you needed.
Yeah, so I said, "Okay, I guess we're moving to Colorado." So we did. So we packed up and then I moved out here on July 1st. And so my son was almost exactly 18 months old and we moved to Colorado, me and him, and started fresh and it was a beautiful thing. There was definitely some hardship coming out here. There was a season of loneliness that I look back and even though it was hard, a season that I know that God had me in for a reason to bring me out here and really rebuild and help me redefine who I was. I was as a mom and as a family, even if that was just me and my son. Even if that was just the two of us, what did it look like to just be a family and to be here and to
Oh.
redefine who I was and then also anticipating, am I ready to date again? And what does that look like? And what will that look like? Or could that look like? And who do I really even want? I didn't
Mhm.
ask for this do over, but I got one. Is there things that I would want to do differently? And to
Yeah.
really be able to look at that and reflect. I did some counseling myself during that time out here, which was amazing. Was working and walked through that season of loneliness. And then at the end of that season, met my now husband. That's a beautiful love story in and of itself. God brought redemption for both of our
Mm.
lives, and it's been beautiful.
How did you meet him? I mean, how
Mhm.
do it's hard enough to date and to meet
Yeah.
people, but you have an 18-month-old, so how did you meet him?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. We met online, we met on a dating app. I feel like that's how it's done these days almost,
Yes, it
especially if you're
is.
of a certain age. And the first date went really well and we really connected. And so then he asked me on the second date. Now, mind you, by the time he had asked me on the second date, my son had just turned 2. So it was like a month after his second
Mm.
birthday, right? So he's little, he's still very small. So he asked me on the second date, and I said, "Well, yeah, I would love to come." I said, "But can I bring my son?" I said,
On your
"He's only
second date, like, "I don't have a babysitter."
Yeah, I said, babysitters are pretty expensive, and he's only 2, and so he doesn't know that mommy's on a date." Like, he just thinks it's a friend. He has no idea, and so he said, "Yeah, sure." And so he had kids as well, and so he said, "Yeah, absolutely, bring him along." We had a great second date shortly after that, 3rd date, and by then, we both said, "I'm in." Took down our profiles and jumped in
Well,
for
and
the
that's
ride.
a good test too on a
Yeah,
second date. It's like, "Okay, he's good with the two-year-old coming. This is good a
yeah,
good sign."
yeah.
And again, two-year-old, that's a reminder of your anniversary of all that you went through.
Yes,
So in 2 years, now you're going on a date with this man
yeah,
that God's just put in your life, and I can't imagine telling your now husband that
mhm.
story when you're dating. I mean,
Right,
that's just a lot to
right.
take in. How old are your stepchildren?
My son is now 6, right? So it's been 6 years. When my husband and I got married, actually, we got married a year later. My son was 3 and his kids then they were 3, 6, and 9,
Okay.
as if we had planned it that way. I thought it
Yeah.
was beautiful.
It is beautiful. Yeah, this beautiful family.
Yeah.
Wow, Lauren, the way that you tell your story with I know it's been 6 years, but, like, with joy on your face and things that God has brought you through, and we talk about grief, and grief is a journey, it's a different time frame for everyone, but to not be able to be stuck in that dark place of that hopelessness, of the days where you don't want to get out of bed, and you're talking about grief and possibly postpartum and all the emotions that go with being a new mom, and you're a counselor. So what do you say to the person that is grieving and they don't know how to get out of it?
Yeah. Yeah. Ironically, sometimes the best way out is to dive in, and that feels so counterintuitive counterintuitive, right? That feels so counterproductive often. And I knew this. I was a trauma counselor long before my husband died, actually. And so the irony is that I walked through grief and trauma and really hard things with other people for many years. And then I got to do it myself in a really major way. It played to my advantage, at least in that I knew what to do, but it didn't make
Mhm,
walking it out any easier, believe
mhm,
me. But one of the things that I've walked through and talked to clients about for years is this idea that so often the tension and the fighting is happening on the surface. We have all these emotions, we have all these things, and it feels like it's quite literally going to consume us. It's quite literally going to kill us or to just completely consume us. So we are fighting that emotion, we're fighting those feelings. And that is actually what's keeping us stuck because we're stuck on the surface. Like I think about these whitewater rapids or these waves that are just like churning at the surface, tossing us to and fro. But we have to go under because under the water, under that surface rapids, the water is actually calm. Oftentimes, the way out is actually to dive in, to surrender to those feelings, surrender to that grief, surrender to whatever it is. Let ourselves feel what we need to feel. I know that feels counterintuitive. And I remember sitting on my couch after my son had gone to sleep and just crying and thinking, if I let myself feel this grief, I don't know that I will come back. It feels
mm.
so deep and so heavy. It's like, I don't know that I'll survive it, but you will. So I know that it feels that way, but I promise that it won't kill you. That you have to just almost let go. You have to surrender and just let go and jump in because it won't last forever. You'll go under the water and then you'll pop back up at some point and you're on the other side of that rapid. And there's more to come. Grief is a journey and it is a river. There will be more rapids. There will be more moments where you're going to have to let yourself feel what you need to feel. But so often we're getting stuck because we're fighting it at the surface.
So, is a
And God.
part of that going under
Mhm.
talking about the person, saying the person's name, having a safe person to talk through things with?
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes it's talking, sometimes it's crying, sometimes it's listening to music, sometimes it's looking at pictures, whatever it is, and I think it's different depending on the moment. Sometimes I really wanted to talk, sometimes I didn't wanna talk at all. I
Mhm,
just wanted to cry. It's all of the above. It's whatever
mhm,
grief looks like, and it's allowing grief to look like whatever it needs to look like in that moment
mhm,
and not being afraid of it, not forcing it to fit in any kind of box or any kind of formula. There's so many sometimes shoulds. Well, I should feel this way or I should do it this way. And I'm like, there are no shoulds in grief. There is only grief. You have to just let it come the way that it's going to come. Don't
mhm,
we get stuck in it because we're fighting it because we're trying to force it into a certain shape or a certain timeline or whatever. And we have to just let it be and let it come.
mhm. And I remember we talked about too, like, so many people come up and say things to you because they don't know what to say, and some of those things can be hurtful in
Absolutely.
those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. So often people say, well, gosh, maybe they've heard that. I don't know what to say. I'm like, don't say anything or just say, I'm sorry. Say, this is so hard. Those things are always going to be safe. Some of the things that people would say often that were hurtful, going back to some of his addiction struggle, I heard sometimes things that if people knew that they would even say things like, oh, well, that explains it, or God was sparing you and your son from having to deal with that issue. Even though some of you listening to this may think, well, there may be some truth to that. But imagine me in this place of grief, because what I hear in that moment is that you're reducing his life and his life and his entire death to his addiction, to his struggle. That's incredibly hurtful because I'm like, wait a minute, that's not the whole of who he was.
That's not
Like,
the whole story, that's not the whole
right.
person.
And that doesn't make my grief any less. Trust me.
Mhm.
It doesn't make me grieve less because he was an addict.
Yeah. 'Cause it sounds like a punishment, and that's not what God's doing either. Like you said, sometimes we just need someone to sit beside us
Mhm.
silently and let us cry or just hug us, and they don't have to say anything.
No, not at all. Yeah. I think
Mm,
some of the other things that are hurtful that people, especially in the church, will do is they'll talk about they'll bring God into it in a way of God needed him in heaven, or God had a purpose for him in heaven, or God took him in some way. Believe me, while we could get into all kinds of fundamental theological discussions on whether or
Mhm.
not that's even true, right, or biblical, but to the person who is grieving, especially in early grief, all that does is make them feel mad at God or blame themselves.
Yes.
They
Yes.
either blame themselves that they didn't need him enough, that
Mm,
God somehow needed him more, or they blame God. And neither
yeah,
one of those things is very hurtful, and it's actually not comforting in the slightest at all.
yeah.
And so often I think people just we're quick to try to comfort, "Oh, don't cry," or, "Oh, I'm sorry I said that." And so often I wanted to be like, "No, please, like, I need to cry," and feeling safe enough to do that in front of someone is actually a gift. Soon as they say, "Oh, don't cry," I know that they're uncomfortable. That puts
Yeah.
me in a place of then having to comfort them or having to
Mhm.
lessen my grief so as not to upset other people.
Mm. Lauren, you are working on a book. The name of the book is Walking Brave. Tell us a bit about that. How did this start for you?
Yeah. I started writing pretty early. I wanna
Mm.
say 6 months after he died, I pulled open a laptop and began a document. Just started
Why?
writing, and some of it was just writing some of the things that were happening, just making
Mhm.
sure that I didn't forget.
Mm.
Some stories of what it was like to walk through grief and what it was like to even stories of just experiencing God's presence and comfort as well, things that I didn't wanna forget. I also started just writing and processing some of my thoughts and feelings around his death and around his life and around God's sovereignty and all of these things that I was wrestling with. It was probably 2 years ago that I started really saying, "Okay, I think this could actually be my story and God's story of redemption in my life." This past year, I finished a manuscript, which felt huge.
It is huge. It's a
Yeah.
big deal.
Yeah, it felt really big, and I'm still in the editing phase. I've been through a couple edits, but still working. I'm learning that the editing phase is quite lengthy. Hopefully going to publish within the next year is my goal.
It'll happen. I think I saw what you wrote on your page, which is encouraging.
Out of all the people that set out to write a book, only 3% of people actually do it.
It's so much work. Like,
Mm,
it's just but like you said, God gave you that dream, that He's gave you that little nudge,
yeah,
and you're being faithful. You're not just praying about it, you're doing it. When your book is published and we are able to purchase it, you're definitely coming back, and we're
yeah,
going to celebrate that together because it's a really big deal.
yeah,
How can people find you, Lauren? I know you have a website and some social media, and I'll put it all in our show notes too.
yeah. Yeah, I have a website, walkingbravebook.com, walkingbravecounseling.org, and then you can find me on a lot of the socials, both Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok as Walking Brave. The name of my book, that's the tagline that you can find me under. Lauren Pryor, Walking Brave.
Good, you made it easy for us.
Yeah.
Is there anything that else you would like to say that you didn't get a chance to?
I would just say throughout all of this, I love the name of your podcast, Redeemed.
Thanks.
The stories don't always look the way that we think they should or need
Mhm,
to in the moment, but God writes good stories, and He is in the
mm,
business of redemption. He knows that hard things happen. It doesn't mean that He causes them or that He wants them to happen. But He knows that they do. He is personal and He is active and He is living and He is present and He is a good God that is a God of redemption. I love just how personal he is and how he's walked with me through this journey that I've been
mhm.
on.
I think one of the Bible verses you gave me was Isaiah 41:10, "Do not fear, for I am with you." The officer showing up at your door. Onto that, you have walked it out, and God has redeemed your story with
Yeah,
your husband now and your stepchildren, and of course, is that the did you wanna go through all those things? No, but God is using you and using your story, and you're allowing Him to. Thank you for your faithfulness. Okay, my friend. Well, until the next time when your book comes out, we will
sounds good.
see you again.
All right, thanks.
You're so welcome. Every time I meet new people and I hear their story, I realize that people go through all kinds of things. It's a reminder that we're not alone in our grief and our suffering and our trauma. When you look around and you think that everyone's got it all together and they have this perfect family, perfect job, it's not always that way. And the enemy likes to deceive us and put those lies in our heads. The enemy likes to put us in a place of shame and darkness of, hey, you can't let anybody know what you're going through. And like Lauren shared, she had people in her corner that she felt safe to be able to share. Thank God she did. Only God knows what was going to happen in her life. And the night that her late husband passed away, she was already surrounded with her parents, and her parents were there to take care of her and love on her. And she took that year off to heal. And that is okay. If you are listening today and you struggle with shame of maybe taking a while to heal, it is okay as long as you're putting one foot in front of the other and you're walking through that grief or you're walking through that hardship and you're not just staying stuck in it. God doesn't want us to stay stuck in that dark place. Make sure that you are seeking help. Reach out to Lauren. Not only does she have the years of experience being a counselor, but gosh, she's lived through some hard things. God doesn't want you to stay in these dark places. I want to remind you a couple of things. If you're putting labels on yourself of shame and guilt, that's not of Jesus, that is of the enemy. Rip those labels off and lay them on the cross because he calls you redeemed. He calls you beautiful. He calls you chosen. You are his. And if you are listening and you don't know Jesus and you want to know him, it is simple. You just ask God to come into your life. You tell him that you believe that he is your Lord and Savior, and you ask him to forgive you of your sins, and he will. And if you need someone to pray with you, then reach out to me. L Burns PT on Instagram. Go to my website, laurenburns.net. You can find me on Facebook. Do not hesitate. Reach out to me, and I would love to pray that prayer with you. Father God, I thank you for the person listening. Jesus, whoever may have been moved by the story of Lauren and the journey that she's walked through in 1 week's time of death and of life, you have redeemed her story, God, that you have walked her through grief, that you have given her a family, that you have given her a husband, and that she is able to share her testimony of the things that you have done, Father. God, I ask that you would pour your love and your grace and your mercies into the person listening today. In Jesus' name, amen. If you found that this episode was helpful and you'd like to listen to another episode, I actually talk about when I lost my little sister at the age, she was 16 years old, Chloe. I believe that's episode 7, and I have a counselor that's on that episode, and she talks about the stages of grief. And so that's a great one to listen to. If you struggle with addiction issues, with alcohol or drugs or painkillers, I have a young lady come on. Her name is Crystal Cuellar, and she's going to share her story of overcoming some addictions. I really appreciate you listening, and I appreciate you sharing the podcast with others and helping get the Redeem podcast out there to the masses. I hope you have a fantastic day until next week.